Hello, everyone. How's it going? Happy Wednesday. My name is Aniket Bulbule. I am the Partner Solutions Architect, and welcome to Howdy Partner. For those who are aware, Howdy Partner is a weekly show where we have our innovative AWS partners to demo their innovative solutions. And I'm joined today by my co-host and my colleague Bhavye. Hey, Bhavye, how's it
Hi,
going?
everyone. Hi, I'm good, Aniket. How are you?
I'm doing good. How's
Uh,
your
have,
week so far? How's your week so far?
week's been hectic, but we're almost halfway there. So feeling good about it. Keep moving forward.
Awesome. Awesome. Perfect. So tell me, who do we have today? What do they do?
Yeah, I'm very excited about the partner that's going to be joining us today. Their name is Theom, and they're a secure data cloud provider. So, do you know
Okay.
what that means?
I have absolutely no idea. I just know cloud, so
So,
I got one word out of it.
All right, so let's break it down. Uh, they provide data lakes, which is a huge repository of data for your business organization. And they provide services on top of it that let you secure it and, more importantly, govern that data. And you might have heard data governance is becoming a big thing on social media and LinkedIn these days, and in AI in general.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about like why do we need governance in the first place? Like why would I need to govern my data?
Well, if you think about it, there are a lot of industries, let's say financial industry or healthcare industry, that have a lot of very sensitive and a lot of valuable data which they want to protect from unauthorized access or it getting leaked somewhere somehow. That could cause them a lot of reputational and financial damage. So data governance is basically providing that set of tools and the integrity of and ensuring the integrity and security of that data to make sure it doesn't fall in the wrong hands.
Okay, that does make sense because obviously privacy and security is really important for me as an individual as well as organizations. And you know the saying we have at AWS: security is priority zero. Uh,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's job one or day one, job one, everything.
yep, absolutely.
I would still consider myself a noob in terms of data governance and data security in general. So I would be honored to invite our guest, the CEO of Theom, as well as the director of routes to market, Grace and Navindra.
Hey,
Thank you, guys, for
hey,
having
Grace,
us.
how's your week?
Thanks, Aniket. Thanks, Bhavye.
How are you doing so far?
Doing well. Doing well. Busy
Doing
week,
well.
but it's good.
Awesome. Thanks for being on the show. Could you just like do a quick intro for our audience? Just tell us who you are and what does Theom do?
Sure, Grace, why don't you start and then I can
Okay,
take the follow up.
I'll kick us off. Hi, everyone. I'm Grace Rotondo, and I lead various partnerships for Theom. So we're very excited to be working with AWS as one of our partners. Navindra.
And I'm Navindra, co-founder and CEO of Theom, and very excited to be here on this forum. Thank you for inviting us. And what Theom does is, like Bhavye mentioned, it scans the customer's environment, looks for things that they should focus on from a hygiene point of view, as well as gives them an early indicator of like you're under attack, and these are the things. This is how exfil is going to happen of data or is happening, and we help remediate or stop that. That's in a sentence what we do.
That's awesome. So I believe, Chris, you have some slide decks that you would like to showcase our viewers just to get a better understanding of how does Theom work? Because I
But
understood that, like,
yeah, I had a question, Navindra. You said something about remediating. Could you explain what remediation means and how exactly is that fixing your security problems?
Oh, yes. So let's say there's a certain hygiene issue, or maybe let's say there's a breach that Theom is detecting live that's happening inside the customer's environment. And if the customer has given us instructions that in this particular case, that's basically config, and we'll show this with the demo. What Theom can do is go stop that breach by actually working with our partners like AWS, let's say there's an S3 bucket or something of that nature, or maybe it's something inside Snowflake or whatever data store we're talking about, where what's applicable, that Theom is picking up this thing. We'll go modify the config so that the data doesn't leak out of the customer's environment. So that's one, blocking the attack. The other side of remediation, if it's a hygiene thing, if permissions need to be fixed, Theom will drive the permission fixing up in the environment.
Oh, it's like having, like James Bond has his, back end, ops team that hacks everything and fixes everything.
Yes.
So it's
Think of it like that. This is the backend James Bond thing.
yeah,
Really.
AI version of that, like having that assistant that's gonna do all the tech stuff for you. So cool. Yeah. Sorry, Grace, you were gonna show us some more information about Theom, so we'd be happy to let you present.
Yeah, I kind of just wanted to give the audience more of an overview of what Theom is before Navindra dives into the product. So for those of you that haven't heard of Theom before, we're a VC-backed startup founded in 2020. We're led by a really strong team of founders. Navindra has, this is his third startup. His last two were both acquired by Cisco. And, I think he can tell it much better than I, but I think what he saw in his experience prior to Theom was that, perimeter security was not enough. And he felt that it was very important to protect your data from within. And so that's kind of what led to the birth of Theom. So from a technology perspective, you got the high level, the sentence, we do data access governance and security, and we embed directly wherever you host your data. And we integrate with several services that AWS offers. And we also are partnered not just at AWS, but with Snowflake and Databricks, two other great AWS partners as well. And as Bhavye mentioned, especially in highly regulated industries like financial services and healthcare, that's where we've actually had a ton of success. And so, in addition to travel and hospitality and high tech as well. So, from more of a use cases perspective, before you get to see the technology behind them all, there are 4 use cases that we cover. The first and really the foundation of it all is data access governance. So that's tracking who's accessing what, at what time, what are they doing with their data, and so forth. And so we go in, we go in and analyze all the access patterns around your data, and we start baselining normal patterns. And then once we have the baseline, we start tracking what looks suspicious. And so that kind of leads us into our second use case, which is insider threat protection. And so from there, once we start tracking suspicious behaviors, we'll start mapping it to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and we can remediate threats before they become breaches via SIMS or whatever kind of tools you already use. From our third use case, we also provide data mesh and contract governance. So this has been very big, especially within financial services, but it's also, I think, very applicable in many other industries as well. As everyone's, using data, there are often contracts in place that govern how a data consumer can use the data provided to them. And those contracts often tell you who at the consumer company is able to access that data and what purposes they're able to access that for. And so what we do is we use the same principles from the data access governance principles and apply that to data contracts to ensure that as a data consumer, you can adhere and comply with that contract. And then on the data provider side, it's to also help you really enforce that contract. And then finally, as everyone is especially excited about Gen AI, we understand that it's not just important to govern the layer that feeds AI, but also the AI models themselves. And so we actually provide governance over AI and security as well by governing RAG, and then also protecting against prompt injection attacks. So with that, I'll turn it over to Navindra, and he'll take you through the product.
Thank you, Grace. Fantastic. If there are any questions, please keep them coming, and we'll answer them as it goes.
Oh, I think Bhavye, you're on mute, but I know that you have a question.
Yeah, I had one question. You talked about implementing data contracts and like codifying like the agreements that are written in business and transforming that into uh, pieces of code and rules that have to be followed inside systems. So that was pretty cool to hear. It reminded me a bit about what blockchain at the beginning of its inception was trying to offer, of having these smart contracts that are able to you can implement some rules that they have to be followed. So really wondering how you ensure that these rules that you implement, that they are always followed. So do you depend on tools like AWS config that are sort of built into these cloud providers, or is there something extra special sauce that Theom has too? I'm sure they do. Yeah.
Bhavye, it's a combination of both. You're guessing it pretty right. Yes, it's. I like your analogy. It is like smart contracts to some extent. Like just for the folks who are listening in, we're talking about this third use case that Grace was discussing. So in this world, what typically happens is there are companies like S&P Global, Bloomberg, especially financials, but this doesn't apply just to financial. It applies across the board, across multiple industry verticals. They've got data sets that they keep sharing with each other, as well as selling. And an example could be like global oil demand or something, and these get exchanged on various platforms: S3, Databricks, Snowflake, whatever you name it. There are various delivery platforms on which these data sets have contracts, where Bhavya is going. So what we use is classic translation for NLP translation to translate that English written legal contract into rules. And then we use technologies that come out of AWS or Snowflake or Databricks or whatever you name it, to keep constant eye on what's actually happening and ensure that that contract is followed. The hard stuff around that, or the tricky things, is when the contract says things like this data can only be used for these purposes and nothing other than these purposes. Finding like, and if and this goes back to what Grace was mentioning earlier in the first bucket, that was the foundation that we had to solve for Theom. What data do you have? Who has access to that data? Who's using their access? When I say who, it could be a machine or it could be a human identity. And what purpose are they using that access for? So that establishing the purpose then allows Theom, so it uses a lot of intelligence on its side to identify what's the purpose for which this access is coming in. And then we go back to the customer, look at the contracts as we've ingested them in, and then say whether you're in compliance with your own contracts which you have signed with your upstream vendors, as well as Theom traces the lineage of data and tells whether there are downstream consumers, whether they're in compliance with the purposes for which you bought the data, and so on and so forth. So Bhavya, hopefully I answered your question. If not, I can add more.
No, that was really, I was not expecting that. That's such an amazing solution, and really cool to hear what you're doing. And I can't wait to see the demo of what you have planned today.
Thank you. So we'll go through some of our initial set of use cases in these buckets, and then dive deeper. So first thing is just visibility across the federated visibility across the environment. So in this environment that we've got set up with this data sitting inside AWS for this hypothetical customer, multiple clouds. They've got Snowflake also, they've got Databricks, and the type of technologies, data store technologies that we're covering in this particular deployment could be like key value stores like DynamoDB, Elasticsearch, various relational databases behind RDS. So Postgres, SQL Server, think of various data stores that Theom is tracking. Also, blob stores or S3 buckets, where it's object stores, where it's unstructured data. Doesn't have to be structured data. Either way, like data could be in all these shapes and forms, including large data lakes and data warehouses and so on and so forth. Theom's first job is understand the data. First, make a lay of the land of what's actually happening in this environment. Sorry, I needed to get into different deployment things. First step is understand the lay of the land for the customer, what data is present, and who's accessing it. And then from there, we start figuring out what risks are present inside this environment. That's the first step that we're going to get towards, and we're going to get towards automated compliance. How do we get into that area thing? So first step again is look at the data, who's got access to the data, what are they doing with their access, and so on and so forth.
So, Navindra, quick question. So, when you say look at the data, so does that also mean that you're looking, like actually looking at the data, retrieving it from the customer's account? But
100%. So in terms of architecture, this runs in Theom engines run in the customer's environment. So it's actually running in the let's say the customer is an AWS customer. Theom runs in the customer's AWS environment or their Snowflake environment, whatever their cloud is, the engines run there. The first step that the engines would do is classify the data, understand, okay, what type of things does the customer have inside their data sets? Like, do they have bank account numbers? Do they have AWS access keys? There are engines to classify every different type of named entity that Theom tracks. Customers could also tell us, okay, this is our sample data, learn on this, and then create my custom taxonomy. So they can extend Theom's custom taxonomy. Theom then groups these things down into things like what's PHI, what's PII in this environment, what's source code in this environment, because we are also tracking what are secrets in their environment, what constitutes secrets, and so on and so forth. So we group all these things into different classes or groups, all the way starting with that one entity, the basic entity, and then taking it up. Did
does
that
that
help?
No, I think that does exactly answer my question, because what I was also curious on is if you are actually retrieving the customer's data, does that not essentially violate any privacy laws, especially if there's PII, PHI data? But I think having this run in the customer's account does solve that problem.
Exactly. That's also jurisdictional control. A lot of our customers are they're highly sensitive on their data and the data jurisdiction, as well as they have their own compliance rules. Like, this kind of data cannot leave my jurisdiction or leave my environment type thing. Because let's say Theom is running in a different region as compared to them, we'll start violating different things. So all our engines run wherever the customer's data is. Typically, our recommendation to our customers is, if this customer is a large AWS customer, we'll tell them run one Theom per region where you are deployed, one Theom engine per region. All of them will all accumulate and show one unified dashboard to the customer, but it'll be one per region from where the crawlers run, process, and things, so that everything stays. All the metadata also stays with the customer. So Theom metadata typically in an AWS environment is kept in DynamoDB. So Theom will create its own DynamoDB inside the customer's environment to keep all these relationships there with them.
Got it. Okay, that's interesting to know.
Perfect. From there, I'll jump into an environment. So we built something like this. This is coming bottoms up. First thing is figuring out, okay, where are credit cards in this environment? Where are QSIPs in this environment? In what type of technologies? What's the financial value? Whether it's the original copy of the data or whether it's a clone of the data, and so on and so forth. What's the sensitivity, and so and so, which account is this present in, and things. Theom will also identify which data store. This could be a table, could be a view, could be an object, could be the most granular piece of things. We normalize this across different data technologies, bring all these technologies in one pane of glass for the customers, and then attach identity to it. So, for example, Ian Peterson in this particular case, Theom is answering the first question. It's building this knowledge graph about the customer's data, identifies has figured out what data does the customer have, what's the sensitivity of that data, in which stores, and so on and so forth. Next step, it's actually going and answering who has access to this data. So in this particular case, Ian Peterson has access to these tables all the way down to what type of entities. Next, Theom will say, what was Ian Peterson accessing over a period of time. So if you default is 90 days, we track all lineage and all of that stuff, as well as access patterns for the last 90 days, from the point we get deployed back in time, things. But customers can tell us these are nerd knobs during config or deployment. They can configure these knobs and say, okay, look past in the last 6 months and then build this view for me, or keep a rolling window of 6 months, and Theom will build that view for the customers, so we know who was accessing what. From here, results will start flowing towards the customer in terms of what risks do they have. So leave Theom to its own analysis. Theom by default will come and start giving interesting things. Like if I give you an example of, let's say, a particular environment, Theom will come up with, and this is Snowflake, I'm picking that up, CIS results on their entire Snowflake real estate, irrespective of however many accounts they have. Theom will go and say, okay, for each one of these different accounts, this is what your pass fail on this control looks like from the implementation group in 2 in this particular example. Or so we go implementation group 1, 2, 3 of CIS, take each one of those CIS controls, apply it across their entire environment, and start telling them what's the verdict on each one of these. So this is out of the box. Theom will do this for the customers. CIS is just one of the benchmarks. We do it for NIST. We do it for all of these different best practices in the industry, including other risk metrics that we are tracking for the customers. And that's really where Theom will go and say, besides all of that other things that we were talking about, you probably want to focus on these other issues, because the sensitivity of data is pretty high in that particular repository that you're sitting on top of. For example, you've got SSN sitting inside this bucket, S3 bucket, which is open, or whatever. These are toy examples, but the idea here is let Theom just run through the environment. It will also price the asset for the customer, so they know the financial impact that they're looking at, what's the criticality of the data inside those assets, and which best practice they're violating, and so on and so forth. So that's just the lay of the land. This all comes out of the box as part of Theom's first run.
Sorry, just a
Sure.
quick question. So you mentioned something very interesting. Is it also determines the price, like the potential loss? So how is it able to determine like a potential financial impact based on the data that is, that has access, that users
Yes.
have access to?
So what Theom actually does behind the scenes is, one, its engines have a connection to the head end. So there's information that comes, pricing information that gets pushed down to every engine deployed in every customer's environment. At our head end places, what we have is presence inside the dark web. We see what the market prices of different types, we see the bids, the contracts, those kind of things. Threat intelligence feeds is what we get, and that gives us the first level of estimation of what type of data is selling for what kind of prices in the secondary market, if you will, if this politically correct way to say that thing. And we use that as a signal inside the engines to start telling the engines how to initially seed their pricing for the customers. Customers who actually use these capabilities of Theom, what they typically do is they connect their pricing APIs to Theom. So when Theom is going through the data, it starts pricing all these different the data inside different stores, because it's crawling through the data. It can exactly go start pricing the data for the customers. And this, why this is useful, is exactly why where you were going, is prioritizing risks to the business. So we can do very efficient pricing and or prioritization for the. And there are two ways typically customers go with, either by asset value or asset criticality, or the combination of both, and the type of vector that is involved.
So does that mean that the asset criticality is inherently tied up with the asset value? Like the higher the asset value, the higher like high critical it is.
Yeah, actually, we keep it independent for the customer, because customers can go and say, okay, irrespective whether you actually tell me the value is $1 million or $10 or something, typically they'll say this thing, if you find bank account numbers, they can move these tiles around. I treat it
I see.
as low priority in my environment, or non-sensitive in my environment. It's just a mock thing. They can move these tiles around to inform Theom how to actually treat different things together. Theom starts with smart defaults for our customers, but then based on what it finds inside the data stores, it can automatically start moving the data stores in terms of priorities.
Got it. That's interesting.
Yeah. So
Navindra, can you also talk to how customers can create rules as well?
oh, absolutely. Things. Yeah, maybe I'll go there. So default, what I was just showing was all these engines come armed inside Theom, and customers can go and say, okay, I want that engine, not this engine, or I want this analysis. Think of engines as just analysis engines that are running inside their environment, all running on top of, if it's an AWS environment, think Kubernetes as a service is what Theom launches in their environment, and the compute is all with them, the data is also with them, the metadata is also with the customer, and they can turn on and off this these capabilities inside Theom. You could also go and say, like I was giving that SSN and S3 buckets as an example there, that this is the engine that was armed to do that. Or customers can go create their own rules on top of Theom and say, and this launches the appropriate engine in the right place. And you can apply this type of rule to all data that's moving around in the customer's environment. That's really data in motion, like APIs or Kafka or message queues and so on and so forth. Or you could say, okay, apply this only on my data lakes. I don't want it applied across the whole environment. And you can select what you want. And these are combinations. Like, for example, you pick a role. So Theom has gone and integrated, figured out, okay, what roles are present inside this environment type thing. It's been looking at their IAM systems and so on and so forth, or Active Directory or Okta or whatever the customer has in terms of authentication and authorization, and says, okay, if I, let's say, pick up nurses as an example, and I'm actually going to go into groupings of type of data. You could actually go and say, if nurses look at source code or they're doing something with source code, I want a certain behavior. Now observe what Theom did here. We didn't have to tell the type of store. I didn't have to say which table, which lake object are we looking at, which account, which. You can keep it very broad strokes from a business point of view. Or, and these are operators, if you match this, or if it doesn't match this, or exactly this value, or whenever you have a newly detected role that pops up and they actually start looking at something sensitive type thing, you can drive different behaviors, and these engines then just keep watching that environment. So essentially what happens is, now this particular rule or this config is following the data wherever it's going. So wherever source code keeps moving around, Theom's job is keep for chasing, keep this rule follows the data wherever that particular data keeps moving around, whichever type of data store technology it gets instantiated on. It's Theom's job hiding all of that technology details away from our customers. uh, yeah, that's at a very high level, and you can tell what actions you want Theom to take, and so on and so forth thing. And that's how you can create your own engines on top of Theom. Like, for example, there's one here, vendors looking at dev secrets, or external third parties looking at dev secrets in my environment. If I've got something like that, a particular engine, and let Theom do that. So if you don't see engines coming from us, you have not seen that by default. And we keep releasing new examples of things that we're picking up in customer environments, or what customers find useful in their environments, and then go from there. And the CIS example that I was giving earlier is just a set of engines that we've gone and coded up from best practices and said, this is what CIS on top of Snowflake looks like. We've taken their entire CIS thing and implemented it as these engines, and these engines just go out as right out of the box. The customers don't have to do anything with that. So that's an example. So first step is all visibility. Just get visibility about, and that's the Sankey or the graph that I was showing between identities all the way down to data. And what people can do with that is do interesting things on top of this data. They can slice and dice their data, slice it by different business units, slice it based on functions of the data. Like, for example, if I'm very eager in this thing, because usually you do this on an incident, there's something that's happened, or something you're investigating. That's when typically people come to these kind of things. And I'm just looking at Ian Peterson in this particular example. I say, okay, filter out everything. I don't want to see the noise, and I just want to see things associated with credit cards. Which all things does he or she have access to, through which tables, and was it the primary copy that they were looking at, what was the value of that data, and which tables or technologies that was. So you can keep adding filters and slice and dice this, as well as add more dimensions. Theom has about 40, 50 dimensions. When we say dimensions, these are these kind of things, columns. You can pick and choose what you want to bring into the system, or make Theom connect into your environment and suck in other metadata about your data, and then Theom can go list all of these things, and you can build your rules or engines on top of all of these. So just by telling Theom what the criteria is. So that
Navindra, I have a question. So you talk about, at the beginning of when we establish what everything means and what data means what, and you said that you monitor someone's environment for the first 6 months, or you try to get that data. So could you talk more about what data should they give you? Like, do you need like the logs, write logs of the databases, or is it like CloudTrail that we're referring to? And what else does a customer need to share with you so that you can best use your AI engines and your NLP engines to help them out?
100%. So let's take AWS as an example. Customer comes along and says, okay, I'm going to deploy Theom in AWS. Again, the customer has a choice, CloudFormation or Terraform, and I'll get to that. This is how Theom gets deployed in a particular environment. Essentially, customer will pick, okay, which regions they want Theom to light up on, and so on and so forth. So once that basic information is given, Theom will create a CFT for the customer, or Terraform, depending upon what they actually chose, what's their deployment model. Customer will review what we do, because they're going to be running, their admins are going to be running this in their environment. Whoever is our champion or our user persona on the customer side will run that. So now Theom lights up there. Theom will just scan that environment and start saying, this is what I'm seeing in your environment, Mr. Customer, or things like that. And I'm Aniket going to answer the question. So it'll start telling, okay, we're picking up things like Elasticsearch, we're picking up relational database, RDS endpoints. These are the S3 buckets, and so on and so forth. And then we'll tell which ones we do have access to or we do not have access to, as in visibility. It's only read access, and these engines are running in the customer's environment. So it does the profiling of the customer's entire environment, and then starts telling the customer, this is where we have visibility into. And then whichever ones they actually want us to dig deeper into, they'll turn around and say, turn that on, turn that Theom on. So they'll give us access into their secrets managers or whatever is there, or Vault, or whatever system. Theom is another machine or an application. Think of it like that, with just read permissions to understand what data is there. Second thing, they'll as part of that CFT, CloudFormation template, and thing that I was talking about, CloudTrail logs. Theom will actually say, okay, these are the logs I actually want access to, because now we'll see all access patterns, and so on and so forth. And there was another key piece that I didn't dwell a whole lot on. So the moment Theom gets deployed, it goes back in time. So studying the logs or all access behavior, our default is go back 90 days in time. So if, let's say, we're deploying today, Theom will go back 3 months back in time, analyze all that access patterns that were there. If the customer wants us to analyze even more, let's say their business cycles run every 4 months or 6 months or whatever, Theom will go back in time, studying all those logs, and start telling the customer, this is what we are observing of your environment. So it's all automated things. We'll tell what we need, we'll bring that, surface that up to the customer, this is what we need access to, and so on and so forth. And then they keep enabling access from their side, and Theom will keep spitting out interesting results. Did I answer your question, Ani?
Oh, I think Bhavye, you're on mute.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes. My dog is barking. I have got a puppy's barking today, so I don't want to.
I think he's also eager to learn more about you.
Towards, maybe if you stay to the end of the seminar, we'll have a session. But
Sorry, go ahead, Bhavye.
I also liked what you said about pricing the assets. Once again, you guys are like just the James Bond assistant. So yeah, sorry, please go ahead.
No, Navindra, I was just going to say, we have a question in the comments. It says, this information seems pertinent to a multitude of personas, data officer, CISO, and risk officer. Can you highlight the aspects of your technology that would apply to each persona?
Absolutely. So I'll do that. And I'll also probably touch on this question later and re-summarize after we've gone through. Some of the discussion that you're hearing us talk about right now is more security oriented type thing. It's more CISO oriented, like CIS standards and so on. So it's around the compliance and risk management side of the house. Where it turns towards the data owner side of the house would be probably an example here on privilege management. And then the true data persona, when they go deeper into data sharing and so on and so forth, would be this lineage. How is data actually moving inside my environment? What's my data topology and things? So I'll take this step by step and then keep highlighting what aspects apply to different personas. So as I go through these boxes, the first part around visibility, who's got access to what, that many people, many personas inside the company typically like to have that kind of visibility. One would be the data product owner itself, or the data owner, because they want to see who are their clients of their data, either human beings or other applications in their environment. So they can see this data product that I've just created, and the data product could be a collection of tables or a collection of views, and on a certain data platform. They just want to see who's actually reading it, how are they consuming it, what are they doing with that data. So that's that persona. When a security person looks at that same view, they are looking from or a risk person is looking at and maybe they have a certain question, or some top executive asked inside the company, who will have in our company have access to highly sensitive data. It's a really hard question to answer. First of all, you have to figure out what's highly sensitive, what do you treat as highly sensitive things. And let's, for hypothetical example thing, all credit cards are considered highly sensitive. So you boil it down to the type of entities. Next is, you can now group all these entities together in Theom and then see, okay, who has access to data stores holding on to this, and boom, you have the answer. So that's another type of persona.
Navindra, can you try changing the view to presentation so that everyone can read what's
Oh,
on each outcome? Thank
absolutely.
you.
Sorry, my apologies. Things. I'll just build out the whole slide so you can read that your
Yep,
ledger.
that's perfect.
Yeah. So yeah, that's an example of this. Another cool thing around principle of least privilege. This is I sold a company back in the day to Cisco. We used to do a lot of zero trust and so on and so forth, all the way down to application layers. Our bigger challenge was, and Grace mentioned this briefly in the introduction, was and my challenge was, okay, many people had access to our larger data lake. Controlling access patterns into a large data lake with 200 petabytes of data or greater is a huge challenge, because you have to manage all these different millions and millions of objects, and so on and so forth. And as well as figuring out what those permissions should be is a big pain thing. So what Theom went and did was solve that took that problem head on, and I'll explain how did we do that here. So in Theom, what because we have all of this information about the customer's environment where we're running, Theom will automatically look at their entire config, like what's provisioned in the IAM systems, what's provisioned in the authorization layer, not the authentication. It sucks out the authorization layer config to say, okay, these are the different personas inside the company that have access to the data. And I'll just dwell into one particular type of store, but has nothing to do with the particular store or technology. The same concepts apply here, but the data is interesting things. So Theom will automatically prioritize what's that table or view that's really important in your environment, where you've got where you have to go fix your provisioning. And Theom will say, okay, these are all the different roles inside your organization that have access down to this table, and these are the type of operations that they can do on top of the data. So they can either insert data, they can read data, they can update data, and anything in red is excess privileges. Everything in blue is your ideal fit for your company and your organization down to this table. So essentially what I'm describing here is how do we generate the how do we uh, automatically find for the customer the principle of least privilege all the way down to their data things, and the finest grain of control. So we'll find whether this is a secure view or whatever that view or that object is, the most finest grain, and we'll figure out the right permissions for every role inside the company, every identity inside the company. All of this done by a machine rather than humans trying to configure this. And then we'll drive configuration. That's the remediation side of the house. But the second box is all talking about permission management down to the data, automate that whole thing. And this is why, if you were observing, this is why we call it data access governance. It's the access, it's not just data governance, it's access to data that we are driving governance, like who's got access, Do they need access? And what are they doing? And I'll get to the next step when we get further in the demo. What are they doing with their access? Yes, Navindra has access to this data. He can read the data. But for what reason is he reading this data? What is he actually going to do next with this data? Or what is he actually doing with this data is what we then move towards purpose-based access control. So one is just simple access control, whether Navindra should have read access, but he should have read access only to do X and Y, but not Z. And that's really, like, for example, I can't read this data and push it out of the company. If I push it out of the company, that's not considered legit use. So I can't become an insider risk for the company. And we'll get to how we actually detect all of that by, I'll get to step 9, and we can talk about that. Hopefully this helps to some extent. So that's second example of what we do. And by the way, in that same vein, I'll finish the thread. I forget which window I was, which tab I was. So this particular case, it's on roles. We do the same thing with identities, human identities or machine identities. In this case, Bob K has access to these different roles. Everything in blue is what he or she needs to do his job. Heads of the department, he doesn't need access to that particular role, and we'll strip that, and we'll drive the right config into the right authorization system. So that's where we close the loop with privilege management. We can also do very interesting stuff. These are very common use cases that come from our customers around. My data should usually be redacted or masked. Often people call it masked, my sensitive data, and it should only be open to certain type of customers. And that's where Theom will go and tell, this is highly sensitive in your environment, that's not masked, and we'll drive fixing up of that. For example, if I go to a certain screen, and this is from redacted data, that there was some data that was highly sensitive, and they identified, okay, in this particular example, customer phone numbers, and these are their very important customers, should not be open to everyone inside the company. It should be masked. And so it's about Theom, because it actually observes the config from every role, every identity, down all the way down to data. It starts lighting up this particular field is open to these roles. You probably want to do something. This is not in compliance with your policies that you told us, or what we sucked out of your contracts, things, and we light this up. Further, Theom can take it a step further, and here it's not a human identity, it's machine identity. And they've got transformer models in these cases, in this particular environment, transform models which were not supposed to even have access to unredacted data. They had access. That was step one that Theom lights up for them. Second thing, Theom says it is actually getting access. So we are seeing read operations go all the way down to data. So your transformers are learning from this data. So that's a separate issue altogether, whether their models are getting tainted or not. But we are seeing reads happen. So the priority of the alerts and all of that becomes higher. And then we could also pick up when the data is getting modified by a role that should not have access to that data in the first place. And that becomes a data integrity issue. Now, this is where lineage comes in. So if this modification did happen, because Theom traces data as it's actually moving through the system, it can tell customers, it got tainted at this place. So now all your downstream things that are working on this data also have a collateral associated with it. Who cares about this thing? Security people usually don't care about this level, about tainting. That's where your different persona comes in. Person asked this question around persona. This would be your data product owners who would be now worried about where is this actually data going, and what's my blast radius from that perspective, and who all do I need to give an intimation if they've got damage downstream about this. So that's an example of this. I covered multiple things in this, not just unmasked data, but also lineage of data things.
So there's another question, follow-up question from another viewer. So the question is, so are you doing some sort of profiling for the users of a user's behavior?
Yes, absolutely. That's really what happens under the covers. We profile and we baseline what this user looks like. And this is how eventually, when I get to number 9 and talk about this, this is how we identify whether this is actually a machine accessing this data or a service account accessing this data versus a human being using service credentials. You all know how things run in operations. Sometimes people use credentials of an application to access the data. And we find this often with our in our customer environments that we get deployed in. And Theom will tell, even though authenticated this particular session or as a service account or a machine or that particular service, it's actually a human being behind this. And then we go through this. So the answer is yes to the person's question, that yes, we do baselining, behavior analysis, and so on and so forth. All of that gets used for Theom.
I have a interesting. Maybe you can correct me, but you just mentioned about how sometimes models can get access to PII data, which can maybe they can end up being trained on something that you don't want them to be trained on. Is that something that you see in when you get that first 60 days of data? There might be some instances where someone is using service credentials to do something that maybe the application itself would not do. So
That's correct.
do you have to like clean that, or does it have does it involve require any manual intervention to pre-process that data, or does your engine figure that out using its gradient function and loss
So
like?
Theom automatically figures that out, and we put it in a report or show it in the UI to the customer. This is what's actually happening in your environment. And then depending upon the remediation, so where human beings get involved with when they want to okay Theom to remediate that thing. So in this example that I was showing here, this is nothing but an AI transformer behind the scenes, which was actually learning based on certain data. And it so happened that this guy, even though it was learning, it was also modifying things, the data itself. So there are multiple issues here. Things one is it had access to something that it should not have access to. It should have been working on redacted data things, but here it was the data was not completely redacted for them. So that was issue number one. Issue number two was it was also changing, modifying the data, which it should not have been doing. It's an inference or not. It's just a learning engine. It's not the engine that's creating the data. So in classical pipelines that we see, AI pipelines that we see in our customers' deployments, there are certain pipelines that actually produce the data on top of which learning will happen. So those are the ones that should have right access to the data because they're producing the data. And again, they should not be modifying old data. So they should only be modifying the latest segment of the data, not the earlier data. So Theom can actually track all of that for the customers on those use cases. And if there's another stage in the pipeline, and that particular stage in the pipeline focuses on learning, it's actually it should only be reading data, and the data before it goes into the learning stage should have gotten redacted and so on and so forth. So Theom can help in all of these stages and drive the right transformation that the company wants us to do.
Awesome.
So that comes out as our automated compliance reports. This is essentially so customers just turn on and turn off what they typically want, depending upon the buying center, the persona, and so on and so forth. So different types of personas are interested in different compliance reports. Like the AI guys would be or the AI governance people or AI access governance people would be more interested in questions like where you were going is my model trained on sensitive data? And if it's trained, or it should not have been trained on any sensitive data, or if it's been trained on certain sensitive data, these are the only things that can access it. It can only be used for these purposes, and so on and so forth. So they'd be more interested in a compliance report like that, whereas other entities inside the company, like from more CIS and things, if you're wearing different hats, they'd be interested in CIS. Are you guys compliant, or are we compliant with CIS? And where are we actually not compliant with CIS best practices or their own company best practices, and go with that. So these would be reports we'd be sending out to the company. We integrate with classic tools like ServiceNow, ITSM tools, whatever their workflows are. So Theom will integrate with those workflows and drive the right workflows in their environment. Other examples, just off the top that we see, hard-coded passwords. Do we have hard-coded passwords in our applications? And Theom will give a list of these are all your applications which we are seeing access to. And usually the question gets framed slightly differently. For lack of space, we kept it very terse. They typically ask us very terse question, like, if I have highly sensitive data, look at all my highly sensitive data and tell me which applications are using hardwired passwords accessing that, and they don't have multi-factor auth or whatever you've gone and actually described as a policy for Theom. So Theom will go and find all those service accounts. This is an example of a view. What type of clients are they coming in from, and so on and so forth, which password is hard for. And we'll also further tell the customer if the client itself has a vulnerability on it when it's actually accessing things. And that vulnerability typically shows up as either service accounts having vulnerabilities or human beings inside the company when they're accessing highly sensitive data, whatever that definition of highly sensitive is, from which particular IP, which particular location, and how many sessions came in, and if there was any behavior difference changes on top of it. So you can arm all of these like in those rules. When Grace asked me to show some of the rules to the team, if I go back to the rules, there's one operator called has abnormal access, atypical access patterns. So if this was armed, if the customer or whoever was defining this, if the behavior goes out of bounds, if you're picking up behavior, data is highly sensitive, behavior has actually gone out of bounds, and that particular application has weaponized vulnerabilities on top of it, trigger a certain workflow for me inside my company, and you can craft a rule like that, and then Theom will take it over from there. So that's a very practical way of reducing the noise, really focusing on the vulnerabilities that you really should be patching out of your, like in these cloud environments, people have huge sets of vulnerabilities that they have to patch. Like take Log4j. Log4j came 2 or 3 years ago in December-ish timeframe. I remember it, or maybe November, December timeframe, it became a big deal a couple of years ago. But now many machines had to be patched. Which ones do you prioritize? Again, this drives prioritization. You could drive prioritization based on the sensitivity of data that they actually are accessing, and there's a behavior change that has happened. Things. So that's an example of this. I double touched on hard-coded passwords. I touched on CVEs and so on and so forth. Things I can talk about humans masquerading and what do we do, and maybe I can actually also launch a live attack in one of our synthetic environments. Things, and then we can look at the results of what Theom is picking up in this environment, and we can go from there. So while it actually starts building up the whole attack and then going from there. So humans masquerading as an account. Typically what Theom will do here is identify for the customer in their environment. And these are panels that light up on the customer's environment, that of your accounts, service accounts, in the last 24 hours, we've been watching, these are different connectors or different applications connected to the data. We'll highlight out of these 400,000 odd connections that came in from this particular application. In this case, it's some Databricks connected into Snowflake environment where they've got their lakes and warehouses all synchronized, and they think of, if you're familiar with the data architecture, there's bronze level data, there's silver level data, the medallion style, gold level data. Often what we find is gold level data would be in some form of warehouse. The warehouse could be a Redshift, it could be Snowflake, could be something. In this environment, it was Snowflake is what they were running as their gold level data, and their processing pipelines, initial stages of raw data coming into their processing was inside some form of Databricks. Now that Databricks system has access, obviously, because it's actually producing the data for the gold level data and pushing it into their warehouses. But there were 5 connections that Theom identified for them, that these are not Databricks. This is actually something different that's actually accessing the customer's environment. And then we start tracing for them. For those connections, even though it was this user and these were the sequence of operations that they were actually producing. In this particular case, there's someone highly like their most important. So Theom is tracing from data. What was that particular object? It's got very important customer data. Last 2 days of the most important customer data that we have, download these documents, and Theom starts telling, okay, you've got some issue here. These are potentially the people who or individuals inside your company from whom this access is happening. And that's what Theom's AI is doing behind the scenes to try and make it really actionable for the customer so that they know their threat teams. This would be a threat persona, or the incident response people, or CSOC, if that's, CSOC would be the better personas, taking the feed of this capability of Theom feeding to them, so that they know there's an insider risk, and this insider risk has elevated to this level that now we are actually picking up data getting pulled out of the environment, and this data has this particular impact blast radius for the company. And it's very closely tied in with number 8. Number 8 is more general data loss exfil detection and prevention. This is specific vector of that thing. So Theom will find all these interesting things inside the customer's environment and start reporting that out. And if you want to go back to getting all of this as a picture, we're talking about use cases in this bucket. So the first bucket was all around hygiene and so on and so forth. But the same foundation drives all of these different buckets of capabilities.
Awesome. For those of you who just joined in, we have Navindra and Grace who from Theom. They are talking about their Theom solution that allows you to not only get a great insight into who's actually accessing your data, so essentially ensuring data access governance, but also automating the remediations. And I think we're just diving into one of the coolest parts of the demo where we're simulating an attack. So hopefully you're able to see that and also understand how Theom can help get rid of such attacks.
I have a question, Navindra, about
Sure.
it might be a little too technical again, but I saw like it was very cool how you were able to track these SQL queries that were being run by individuals, and I was curious. Like I saw there were select queries being recorded as well. So does your system actually process like each and every query that goes through these data instances, or is it like does it sample a few of them? Uh, because I can imagine like if you try to record every SQL query, that processing requirement might get really huge.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Thing. So Theom looks at all SQLs, all operations, whether they're notebook jobs, whether they're SQLs, whatever it is, it sees everything that's happening. And you're absolutely right. Your hunch is also right. It'll be very expensive to do that. This is also another reason why Theom runs inside the data store. So we run with the data store as close to the data as possible. In cases wherever the data store, and that's the beauty about the architecture, or the secret sauce about the architecture, or what we've gone in novelty about what we've gone and built inside Theom, is we run attached inside the particular data store, so and promise zero performance impact to the customer. And that is something that we truly stand by. Things We don't insert a proxy. There are solutions built back in the day where queries had to go through a proxy used to look at what's going into the data store, what's coming out of the data store. All of them are brittle. Those kind of things make the architecture brittle. The way Theom attaches is we study every data store technology. Like we study how Redshift works, what are its interfaces around Redshift, how does Snowflake work, how does each one of those data stores that you saw, and we figure out what's the best way to connect into these data stores so that we see the entire digital exhaust of the data store without actually adding performance penalties on the data store. And that's where I leave it. So the best of both worlds. Customer doesn't have to pay in terms of performance penalties. Applications keep blazing at the full speed that they currently are blazing. And Theom will look at the complete digital exhaust of the data store and see what's actually happening inside the data store. And the way, and in terms of my background, back in the day, I used to build things for Bigtable, and this was way back at Google days in the decade of 2000s thing. When queries come into data store, any operation comes in, it usually gets translated into something called a logical plan gets created, because you have to figure out you've got a SQL query or whatever query has come in needs to be translated into, okay, logically this is how I'm going to execute this plan. Next step, typically what happens is you create a physical plan of that. So these are the files or the file types I'm going to hit, and so on and so forth. These are the indexes I'm going to use, and so on. So this is what a database engine essentially does, or a query processing engine essentially does. That's what Theom is actually watching. It's looking at what that thing is doing, so it doesn't miss anything. It's actually seeing how things get executed and then takes that exhaust. Everyone else tries to approach this problem sitting outside the data store. What we did differently is we sit with the data and see what's actually happening to the data and go from there. This is how we see those sequels, and we'll join everything back for the customer thing.
Yeah, I can imagine it takes a lot of effort for you guys to do what you like. You have to do what you do so that your customers can barely like see anything that's going, because it's a really cool solution and does so much. But yeah,
Thank
please,
you.
that was a great one. Yeah.
Yeah, I took way longer. Then I just wanted to launch this thing. This particular attack that I was launching here essentially goes through the classic steps of build up. So if we're a hacker or I'm a hacker, this is typically what I'll go and do. I'll do step one, step two, step three, through all the classic stages. What Theom is going to do is see this whole thing build up, like forget hygiene part of Theom. So there's a recon phase in the attack sequence where they reconnaissance the particular environment, do a recon in the environment, figure out what are the ways we can get in into this particular data environment. Then they actually infiltrate into the environment if there's a bad actor present, and essentially, but then they collect intelligence, and this goes over a few days. Could be really fast or scripted in case they've already got their attack all figured out, and so on and so forth. The attackers then create these run books or playbooks, for lack of a better word, which is their exploit. They start launching their exploits and go. What Theom does is maps everything that we are seeing and puts it into a bucket. Like these things, for example, here we're picking up atypical logins that are successful going into the environment where Theom is picking up. There's something odd about this login, even though it was successful. And then from that point on, Theom is chasing this thing. So at any point, it gets the breadcrumb. It'll actually, and this is people today, if they try to do this, they do it after the fact. So first of all, the state of art in the industry typically is they don't look inside data stores. They look at endpoints. Your classic XDR, EDR type platforms look at endpoints and so on and so forth, and they're looking at what happened on those endpoints. And threat hunting happens in reverse after the thing. What Theom is doing, it's doing it live. It's studying as operations are being done, and its engines are all processing. These are those AI engines that are running inside the customer's environment. They're actually categorizing this and building these blocks and saying, okay, grants are changing, permissions are actually getting modified, and so on and so forth. I'll walk through this sequence of attack, what happened in this environment when I click this, all the way down to data exfil, where Theom at every point of the way, we'll actually tell the customer, now your data is actually getting unloaded from your environment, and this is how it's getting unloaded, and so on and so forth. At any point of time, because Theom can integrate with the customer's environment, whatever that environment is. They could be a Splunk shop, if Splunk is their SIM SOAR platform, if they're using Watchtower, whatever they're using in their environment, Sentinel, or whatever technology they're using, we're technology agnostic. They can run actions from there or run actions on top of Theom. So you could take different ways to do it. So let's say in this particular attack buildup, there was some abnormal login that we picked up, and there are a sequence of engines that just run and figure out which login is normal, which is not normal. A whole bunch of unsupervised learning engines run and baseline what's normal for this customer. And this is why we study data over a period of time. So the moment we get deployed, we go back in time, studying how is this environment really running, and we find all of the good stuff around it. We see who does what kind of operations inside this environment, who grants permissions. Theom will learn all of that good stuff out, and then start finding interesting things like, oh, SOC notifications in this particular case just got disabled inside the data store. So they're trying to blind the system. So okay, that's interesting for Theom. So it's not triggering anything. It's just going through and studying this thing. Then it'll actually pick up all successful alterations of policies, unsuccessful alterations of policies, and so on and so forth. Things the team will go and say, okay, someone was actually just allow listing certain addresses, and so on and so forth. It'll also find, and where did they come from? What was it trying to do? And so on and so forth. It'll also find failures. If the failure ever happened, you're seeing various examples of things, and that is interesting for it. It'll see where the compute is getting modified inside the warehouse or the data lake, or what type of compute got just attached. So existing compute got modified, task got attached, and so plethora of things. The dashboards that pop up here are all oddities in their environment. If there's nothing interesting, we won't even actually show in. And all of these are engines built by Theom. Customer doesn't have to do anything. If they bought the license, they get all of these capabilities, and we'll start integrating with the customer's environment. We'll start figuring out things like, oh, they're actually, this particular identity is trying to triangulate and discover the environment. So they've gotten in, they're trying to see what are the ways to get to their interesting data. And Theom will now start telling the customer, it'll start warning the customer what data is at risk. So till this time, we are just earlier in the attack cycle, seeing the thing build up, till the point where we start giving an early hint to the customer what data of yours potentially is at risk, because the funnel is narrowing now, because they're doing intelligence collection and so on and so forth. You will say, okay, most likely they're going after that piece of data. We'll see the lateral movement happening inside the data store, what thing that they actually start moving towards, and so on and so forth. And then we'll find, okay, those data stores are what they're looking at. You'll also find, okay, now what's their route out of this environment? How are they going to take data out of this environment? So we'll start looking at all the exit paths from this. In this particular example, this hack, Theom was actually seeing alterations on stages that were done. Stages are classic data pipelines, and there could be various stages like S3 buckets or things like that attached behind these pipelines. So if you're familiar from the networking world, this is essentially, or tap and span, if you've heard of those kind of words, you can tap any point inside a pipeline and say, okay, at that stage of the pipeline, whatever the previous stages were generating, give me a copy of that data and dump it into this S3 bucket, which happens to belong outside my organization. And observe, this is being done inside the SaaS store, whatever that SaaS store is. So there is no control that will catch this outside. So this has happened right inside the SaaS. There's no firewall, there's nothing of that sort. And Theom picks this up often inside customer environments where data just gets expelled out using various of these techniques, or the data itself gets encrypted and then gets transferred. So if the attacker is encrypting the data that's interesting, because any intermediate observer would only see garbage or gibberish going through them. So Theom will go and tell, oh, that's in, we'll know the keys with which it was encrypted. I don't have that example here, but Theom will also track the keys and so on and so forth to give it to the customer. So we tell various methods of exfil is what Theom will go and tell. This is the method through which data is being expelled out of your environment. And that's the general bigger bucket around data loss. This particular case that I showed about with sequels and things like that, we use that to triangulate and tell the customer, this was your blast radius, this was the data that was is getting copied out. And at any point of time, if the customer has armed us with the right rules, we can start driving the disconnect functions and so on and so forth things. Yeah, so any questions? I'll pause here. I know I've given a lot of information things, but that's really what Theom does for those first two buckets around hygiene, and the next step is data exfil.
No,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
I don't have any questions.
Perfect. Then I'll continue. Now, changing to the other persona that someone asked, okay, you've got possibly multiple personas you sell to? Yes, absolutely. Theom sells to multiple different personas. They've got their own requirements. So the product is very flexible. It all starts off the same foundation, and that's around contracts and governance. The contracts and governance essentially is things like, I started off with a brief example around, let's say, a data set like S&P Global or Bloomberg, or data sets from IQVIA if in the healthcare industry, and so on and so forth. So what Theom will trace is who's actually consuming this data. Customers can give us contracts. Contracts that uploaded into Theom. Theom chases the lineage of data. So essentially now because we were observing all the SQL operations, all the notebook jobs, Theom can actually say how the data is actually getting transformed and moving hop by hop, and which table is getting created, which columns are getting created, and so on and so forth. And then we give reports back to our customers, whether they're in compliance with their own contract they signed upstream with their data vendors, as well as are their downstream consumers consuming the data as per their contracts. So let's say I'm a customer, I'm a data provider, and I've got customers outside my company consuming my data. I want to and when we signed a legal contract, we signed contracts around these are the purposes for which you can use my data, and if you want to use it for any other purpose, let's say this, you need to pay more to me in terms of licenses or whatever that allowed use is. And software developers on this particular webcast would probably be familiar with things like Amplitude. Amplitude is this product we often use in the front end side of the world. Like, how is my product being used, how many people click on this button, then go to that page, then go to that page, how did they dwell, where they did dwell on, and so on and so forth. So Amplitude does this for products from a UI point of view. But for data, this type of insights is when your product is not application, but your product is a data product, like something like these guys, their products are data products that they sell to other companies. They want to know how their downstream customers are using their data and what are they using it for. That's where Theom comes in, again helps those. That's a different persona that we sell to, but again is built on the same set of foundations for them things. And that's where we go with our other great use case around data mesh, contract governance, and so on and so forth things.
Sounds to me like you put up a mirror in front of your customers and actually show them like what's going on. Like it can get, I would imagine this can get a little uncomfortable for some people to actually see that, okay, this sort of stuff is happening in my organization. And
100%, and that's usually one sales challenge. So this is why RBAC is very important inside the product. So right persona should only see the right type of data, and they go from there. So otherwise people get scared. Yeah.
I think one thing that is interesting though is customers can use this to help like foster trust with their own customer base, and if for their own customers who want to make sure that their data is being handled correctly, our customers can use us for that.
definitely, yeah,
Very, very good point. Exactly, Grace. She hit the nail on the head. I think that's what many of our customers, when they're big institutions, they're actually saying, okay, give me your data and do this. Or first, they just want to get their own visibility about what's actually happening in my environment. That's step number one. Step number two, they often turn around and tell their customers, trust us, and this is why we'll give you a portal, Mr. Miss Customer of theirs, that we'll give you a portal that you can see how your data moves inside my organization. What do we do? And it tremendously builds trust for those guys, and they can charge extra or something like that, and say that the reason you're coming to me and as a provider for this particular service is because we can give you that transparency report of how we actually work with your data and what all things touch your data, look at your data, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I wish my bank account had that feature. I would
Yeah, I
definitely.
know. I wish that too. If some of our personal sites use this, yeah. But Grace had a very good observation. That's something that we hear from our customers using Theom for. This is what I pretty much had planned, or we had planned for talking. We can go into any unscripted, any place you want to take us, and go from there. So I can give.
But I'd like to start off. First of all, that was a great presentation, and it's so fun to have someone who's that knowledgeable about it's not just the current industry standards, but like at AWS migration and having that knowledge of that legacy infrastructure is also important. So it was very fun to hear from you about your experiences in the past and what all you've built. I would like to steer the conversation a little bit towards AI training, and I know we touched about it a bit on transformers and how they pick up data. But other than the training step, do you see any interesting use cases for the inference stages as well? Like I see in your fourth point, you have mentioned inference, but yeah, if you had anything about.
Absolutely, I could go there. Things so things that we typically do is where we get engaged with our customers is wherever you see this Theom logo, and this is a very high level flow, and I'll explain this. Wherever you see Theom is where Theom typically gets involved in AI systems or Gen AI systems, LLM based systems, where let's say inference and RAG is really important for the particular customer. And I'll explain the flow first and then talk about it a bit more and see whether this helps. So typically they have API gateways or load balancers. People have, or some web service where various customers of theirs, whether these are internal customers, external customers of this particular enterprise, can come and let's say a chatbot. They can actually issue a query inside a chatbot and say, or the prompt, and then expect answers. So initially, auth happens at this layer. Are you even supposed to be using this chatbot? That classic things. Some AAA functionality would do that thing, and that is very industry standard thing. Nothing new there. This typically will feed the prompt into a stage called an initial prompt thing, which actually holds the prompt while the context gets, like, for example, in our case, if let's say my query is give me compare me to the median salary of my grade, my salary versus median salary, where do I stand? And let's say both Grace and I both ask the same question. The system really needs to know the context, as in, this is Navindra, this is Grace, what's their grade, all of that kind of things. And should they even be asking this question? What sort of data should I use even to compute the results? And then, so the prompt just gets sparked while the context is getting retrieved. And this is typically where, to prevent hallucination and all of that fun stuff, anyone familiar on the AI side would probably know that all of this stuff. So often technologies, vector databases are used. There are new technologies like graph vector databases, depending upon results similarity that you want. But either way, it doesn't matter. Theom comes here, and Theom is helps customers by forcing the right controls on that particular data store, that the right row, column, whatever inside the nearest neighbor algorithm that's running inside the vector database, that the nearest things can only, these things can only be searched, and so on and so forth, so that the right context gets pruned and gets fed back to the RAG engine. The RAG engine creates this context, passes it to the prompt. The prompt engine puts all of this together, and then the prompt optimizer runs. These are all classic things because you don't want to waste your LLM inference bandwidth. So those are precious resources, because they're most likely, if it's a sophisticated engine, it's it's getting powered by some GPU under the covers. So you want to get your optimizers to look at it. There's nothing but a SQL. It's somewhat similar like a SQL optimizer type thing. So you go through that stage, and then this is the gateway to your, usually there's some form of gateway into your true LLM infrastructure behind the scenes. Why you want a gateway is because you may be changing models behind the scenes. You're doing A/B testing of your models as the thing. So this is that shunt layer, which allows you to shunt. If this generates a SQL, because the backend is probably SQL based, it'll generate the right SQL, or it actually just goes into an analytics job, or it just gives this whole bag of collection of data and says, reword this to me, depending upon what your LLM is supposed to do. Some cases, LLMs are code generators also, which can generate the right SQL, fire the right query, results come back, and then that result then flows back. There's an output filter that gets applied. That's a last line of defense. Are we actually spitting out things that we're not supposed to, and then pass this output? So where does Theom actually help? First is, should this compound identity, when I say compound identity, I mean what's the service and what's the user behind the service, the identity behind the service. Take that and see what should they be looking at, and what should the permissions be. For the first stage, whether this is an inference engine should not be modifying the data, should not be inserting data into the vector database and things. So that's what Theom will go curtail down. And in case it's on the serving side of the house, Theom will actually go and say, okay, this compound identity, when we look at the secondary identity, which was this kind of individual, what should they be looking at? So we drive various functions inside this, and we'll also be driving the same set of controls on this side of the house, and go down that path. But foundation is this, somewhat the way I look at it, the foundation is the same. It just so happens that we are talking about AI here, but it's essentially, what data do you have, who has access to this data. If you can curtail that who has access to be really narrow, and what is really, should they even have access to that data, if you can do that well, a lot of the attacks get filtered out. And the last step is things, what purpose are they using it for? And that's really where Theom tries to profile what's the purpose behind these different individuals. And but eventually it all fits into the same mechanism, and that's how we've been serving or solving the pain point for our AI customers. Hopefully this
Yeah, databases are like very big right now, and I was one question about that part specifically. So when Theom interacts with, or integrates with your vector database, does it actually modify the permissions? Like, does it have different permissions per user, compound identity, like you
Yeah,
said?
it can absolutely drive this. We never got to remediation and things like that to talk. But Theom can absolutely drive permission management, where through API or the UI, you could actually go and say remediate this thing or change these permissions of this particular thing, and then Theom is directly working with the database. Here, I did it manually. Things and it'll go modify the right permissions so that things get really tightened down. Like algorithmically tightened down to the minimal set to keep everything working.
So a follow-up question on that, like assuming I, as a customer, I do like through APIs or through the console, I do this remediation. Does that also get like, does my team get notified about this has been remediated? So if
Yes,
in case some of the user profiles might not have access, at least they
yes.
might be aware of this.
100%. This will so usually this is why we work with our customers about remediation is something case by case. We work with customers. What's your remediation workflow? One is telling what your ideal state should be. The other step is actually telling the customer, like there's a state machine it actually runs through things while it's remediating. It'll also generate the right artifacts and the right systems, so they know Theom actually did this and this was the sequence. So you can be very specific. If the value of the data is X, Y, and Z or greater than X, Y, and Z, that's when I want you to do this kind of behavior, auto remediate. Or if the data is leaking out of my environment, I want you to stop it or quarantine it. Quarantine is probably a better word. Quarantine it so that we can have a second look at it before it leaks out of our environment. And same thing with permissions. Everything, all those rules, wherever we were talking about those rules earlier, you can drive what actions you want them to take it so that the loop gets closed.
Got it. That's interesting.
Navindra, what do you do once you have such a great product? Like what?
We do selling. So that's what we're doing here. So,
All right.
it was tongue in cheek, but yeah, truly, most of our effort, Grace, me, and the rest of the teams, selling side of the house focuses on talking to customers, getting it deployed, learning from customer deployments, what's working, and frankly, a lot of feedback. We've been getting a lot of really good feedback. I want you to change this workflow into such and such workflow so that because in our environment there are customers. This particular example I'm giving, they have golden configs for doing permission management, and those systems need to be updated. In which case, Theom doesn't go directly into the data store and manages this. It actually goes into the golden config systems and changes things there so that the next 24-hour cycle, when that, because they've got existing workflows, so we'll integrate. So we learn by customer to customer as we're deploying, and these are typically large enterprises. They've got things ironed out, and you brought in on-prem systems, legacy systems, so we need to figure out integrations with those systems too. Data doesn't just stay in a vacuum in one type of data store technologies. There are pipelines all around the place. So a lot of custom work here to make things deliver outcomes to the customer. It's not just pushing a technology and throwing it over the wall and moving on. It's actually delivering an outcome for the customer. The customer gets the outcome, customer is happy, we get the next referral from them, and go from there.
Yep, I think you bring up a great point. So we did share the links for if our viewers want to try it out. We shared the contact you link as well as the marketplace link. So to all our viewers out there, feel free to give it a try. Yep, there it is. And if you see any particular feature requests, I'm pretty sure Theom, Navindra, Grace, they'd love to hear from you. And that's essentially, that's a good way to iterate on, as Navindra mentioned, that's a good way to iterate on the product, get customer feedback, and iterate on that.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Navindra, for answering so many of my questions. And let's give it a minute. Let's see if chat has anything they would like to ask before we sign off for the day.
Yep. Thanks a lot, Navindra. I think one of the key highlights for me was not only about how the technology works and like what it helps with, but how does it help the business, and how does it, especially if I think you must be knowing that, like, I'm referring to the asset value and the criticality of the data access governance. because as you saw, our viewers had the questions around how can different personas use this. So see, like any company, CISOs and CEOs, they'd care a little more about the business impact and what damage it is causing to the organization. So I loved that piece of the demo. But yeah, thanks again for joining us. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
the solution. I don't believe. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Okay.
Yeah, thanks again, Navindra. It was literally felt like I was James Bond, and I was getting a look behind the scenes about how so many cool things happen. Really appreciated the time you gave us, and a great session overall. I don't see
Thank you
any.
for having us. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank
Yeah,
you so much, AWS. This is awesome. Really appreciate your questions and the opportunity to be here. And thank you all for joining. If you have any questions, want to learn more about Theom, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can reach out to me, Grace at Theom.AI. And, happy to schedule and talk about, whatever you're working on within your organization as well.
Thank you.
yeah.
Absolutely.
And to our viewers, next week we'll be having Vasion as our Howdy partner guest. They're the creators of Printer Logic, which is a tool that I know I've used a lot. So excited to have them, and thanks all for joining.
Oh, just before we log off, I'd request all of viewers to please fill out the survey. Just helps us understand how we did. I think the survey link should be in the chat. But thanks again, Navindra. Thanks, Grace. Thanks, Bhavye, and thanks to our viewers for joining in.
Thank you.
Thank
Take care.
you. Have a good one.
Take care.